Hi everyone, it's Katrina.
Number 10. Elizabeth Bathory. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was by far the most vicious female serial killer in history. However, it's difficult to know when exactly the facts run out and fiction begins. Was Elizabeth Bathory the real-life Count Dracula who bathed in the blood of her victims? Or was she simply an evil woman who did cruel things to her servants? What we know for sure is that the Countess was born in 1560 to a wealthy family. Her relatives ruled Transylvania within the Kingdom of Hungary as an independent principality. When Elizabeth was around 11 or 12 years old, she was betrothed to another aristocrat, Ferenc Nadasdy. Then, 2 years later, she had a baby. However, the child belonged to her lover of low status, not the man she had been betrothed to. Nadasdy was furious to hear of this baby, and he tortured Elizabeth's lover as a result. The child, born out of wedlock, was then quietly hidden from the public eye. Elizabeth was later married to Nadasdy at the age of 14, and the couple lived together in a fairy tale castle. But not quite with the fairy tale lifestyle. Not too long after their nuptials, rumors began to spread that Elizabeth was torturing and killing young girls. But she was still only a girl herself, which means she was probably an evil child or just had really bad experiences in her young life. At first, she only targeted her servant girls and the daughters of local peasants. But she later began to go after girls that were sent to her by local prominent families to learn good manners, like ladies in waiting. This is when people really began to take notice of Elizabeth's evil crimes. There were whispers that the woman drank the blood of the young girls because she thought it would preserve her youthfulness. Witnesses began to come forward, admitting to seeing Elizabeth slice her victims with scissors, stick them full of needles, and burn them with hot irons. Her husband eventually died in 1604 when Elizabeth was 43 years old. It wouldn't be until 1610 that the Hungarian authorities finally decided to investigate the alleged 600 murders she had committed. She was arrested in December of that year, then confined in a castle instead of being put on trial because of her status as a noblewoman. She lived out the rest of her days in solitary confinement until her death in 1614 at the age of 54. Number 9. Darya Saltykova. Darya Saltykova was a Russian noblewoman born on March 11, 1730. She grew to be as notorious for her sadism in the Russian Empire as Elizabeth Bathory was in Hungary. This is due to the fact that she tortured and killed many young female serfs beneath her. Darya was born into wealth. Her father and mother were both part of noble Russian families, and so she was truly born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She would go on to marry a nobleman, and they had 2 sons. However, she was widowed in 1755 when she was only 25 years old. With her husband dead, Darya received a significant sum of money through inheritance. A large estate was also passed down to her, where she moved in with her sons and her serfs. Initially, complaints about deaths at the Saltykova estate were ignored by the authorities. Because Darya was so well connected in the Russian court and with the Russian nobility, the local police didn't want to get on her bad side. But after 138 suspicious deaths were reported, not even Darya could hide the truth. The families of the victims brought a petition before Empress Catherine II, who decided to make an example out of the noblewoman. Catherine had Darya tried publicly, and the royal murderer was later arrested in 1762. 6 years later, Darya was found guilty of killing 38 people. Since the death penalty had been abolished a few years earlier, the empress was not entirely sure how to punish Darya. She ended up displaying her on a public platform in Moscow with a sign around her neck detailing her crimes. Darya was humiliated before she was sent to prison to spend the rest of her days in a dusty cellar. She stayed there up until her death on December 9, 1801. Number 8. Queen Anula. Queen Anula was the leader of an ancient kingdom called Anuradhapura, which dominated Sri Lanka starting in the 4th century BC. The kingdom would survive until the 10th century AD, lasting an impressive 1,400 years. According to historical records, Queen Anula ruled over Anuradhapura sometime in the 1st century BC. Much like any other ancient kingdom, this one was filled with ambition, betrayal, and assassinations. A man named Chora Naga ruled over Anuradhapura following the death of his father. Chora reigned for 12 years and then suddenly died shortly after getting involved with a consort named Anula. It's believed she poisoned his food. When Choranaga's son took over the throne, he would rule for 3 years before he, too, was fatally poisoned. With the last heir dead, the seat of the kingdom went to a palace guard, who just so happened to be having an affair with Anula at the time. Not surprisingly, after ruling for just over a year, he was also killed by poison. After murdering 3 men at least, Anula finally became queen of Anuradhapura, but all of her work would be in vain. She only ruled for about 4 months before Kutakana Tisa, a man who belonged to the royal bloodline and fled the city in fear of Queen Anula, returned with an army. He then seized the throne and burned Anula alive in her own palace. Number 7. Queen Elfrida. Queen Elfrida was born an English noblewoman sometime in the 10th century. Although we don't know what she looked like, historical records say that she was renowned for her beauty. She was so gorgeous that she attracted the attention of King Edgar of England. In order to see if the woman lived up to his standards, King Edgar sent his friend Ethelwold, a powerful nobleman, to visit Elfrida. However, when Ethelwold looked upon the woman's beauty, he fell in love with her, and he sent word to the king that she was misshapen, ugly, and dark. It was Ethelwold who would go on to marry Elfrida, and together they ruled an area the size of Normandy with little interference from the official royal family. But this wasn't enough for Elfrida. When her husband died in 962 AD, she would go on to marry King Edgar himself. It's even rumored that Edgar and Elfrida were in love the whole time, and that they plotted together to murder Ethelwold. Their marriage was as good as it got in the 10th century, but then Edgar died in 975, leaving her alone with his son Edward from a different woman and their fully biological son Ethelred. Elfrida was not pleased that Edward was next in line to inherit the throne. Then, after he was crowned king, he visited her in 978, where he suddenly turned up dead. His murder was blamed on a servant, although everyone is pretty sure it was Queen Elfrida. With the troublesome stepson dead, it was much easier for her own son Ethelred to take the throne. How far would you go for your own kids? Let me know in the comments below. Number 6. Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was an extremely wealthy woman who lived in New Orleans and is famous for torturing and murdering her slaves. Her family moved from Ireland to New Orleans in the late 18th century, and Delphine was born around 1775. She got married to a Spanish officer in the year 1800, and in 1804 they traveled to Spain. Delphine gave birth to a daughter on the boat during their journey, and before they reached Madrid, her husband was dead. Once they reached their destination, Delphine changed her mind about Spain and she sailed straight back to America. She went on to marry a banker shortly after her return, but 8 years later, he too wound up dead. So Delphine married a doctor named Leonard in 1825, and the two of them moved into a mansion. This was around the same time that rumors began to spread about Delphine. Although she wasn't technically nobility, she was part of a new generation of wildly wealthy Americans who were a lot like the European nobles. In 1834, a fire broke out at the couple's mansion. When the police investigated the incident, they found her cook dead and chained to the stove. Apparently, the man had been terrified that he would be sent to the attic for something he'd done wrong, and so he burned himself alive to avoid it. When the police searched the attic to see what the man was so afraid of, they found a secret torture room filled with the mutilated bodies of slaves. Delphine LaLaurie had been practicing some of the most inhuman torture imaginable, using primitive devices to mangle her own servants. In the end, an angry mob swarmed the mansion with the intention of dragging Delphine out, but she somehow managed to escape and was never seen again. Number 5. Giulia Tofana. In the 17th century, Giulia Tofana was one of the most skilled murderers in Italy. She was born in Palermo in 1620, and 13 years later, her mother was executed for murdering her own husband. As she grew up, Giulia toiled with many different natural ingredients in order to become a master poisoner. She went on to start a business selling deadly poisons, which she would sell to women so they could kill their lovers, as she traveled across Sicily, Naples, and Rome. Giulia ran this successful business for many years as one of the world's first mafia crime bosses. She really was an underground queen of murder, supplying the weapon to get rid of hundreds of abusive and generally unlikable men. She remained the leader of Rome's murder scene up until everything came crashing down when one of her clients got cold feet. That same woman sold Giulia out to the authorities. Rome's great poisoner confessed to killing over 600 men from between 1633 and 1651. She was later executed in 1659, along with her own daughter and many of her associates. Anyone who was even remotely connected to Giulia was also killed. Number 4. Elizabeth Brownrigg. Elizabeth Brownrigg was not born to a noble family, but to a working-class bloodline in 1720. She married a man named James who worked as an apprentice plumber, and they would have a total of 16 children. However, Elizabeth had atrocious luck, and only 3 of her babies survived through infancy. As time wore on, James became a successful plumber, and Elizabeth took on a job as a midwife. She was later given the appointment of overseer of women and children at the local parish. But just so like many women who came before her, Elizabeth was evil and twisted. Even though she wasn't nobility, she still had her own servants. Her job allowed her to have custody over several domestic servants, which was quite customary during the mid-1700s. Instead of being nice to them, Elizabeth tortured them. She would chain them to wooden beams and beat them and whip them mercilessly. She did even worse things that I can't go into too much detail about. Many of these servants escaped and went to the authorities, but it wasn't until Mary Clifford died from her infected wounds that Elizabeth was arrested and made to stand trial in August of 1767. Mary Clifford was only 14 years old at the time of her death. In the end, Elizabeth was found guilty and charged with murder. She was ultimately sentenced to be hanged for her awful crimes. Number 3. Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev was the ruler of Kievan Rus between 945 and 960. She is known specifically for her brutal enslavement of the Drevlian tribe that was responsible for murdering her husband, Igor of Kiev. Olga's grandson Vladimir would eventually go on to convert the entire nation of Kievan Rus to Christianity. However, Olga is also admired by the Eastern Orthodox Church to this day for her part in the widespread conversion. When she was baptized, she was given the name Helena after the mother of Constantine the Great, who was a saint. She was the first woman to rule Kievan Rus, and she was only given the throne because her son was not yet old enough to take the position himself. But during her short time in power, she killed a lot of people. Like I mentioned, her husband was killed by the Drevlians after an unexpected uprising. The Drevlians were very successful and they became confident in themselves, so much so that they showed up to Kiev demanding that the queen marry the very warrior who killed her husband. Caught by surprise, the queen accepted and told the royal party to come back the next day. She was kind of in a difficult position here, you have to admit. What would you do if someone killed your husband and then forced you to marry them? Plus, you're a woman in the 900s. Anyway, when they returned, they expected to be given honors and planned to take the widowed queen with them. But the Drevlians were in for a nasty surprise. The wedding party was tossed into a pit and buried alive while Olga watched. After that, she delivered a message to the Drevlians insisting they send more men to share in the festivities. However, when they arrived, Olga locked them all in the bathhouse and set it ablaze. What do you think? Serial killer or warrior queen? Let me know in the comments below. Number 2. Alice Kyteler. Alice Kyteler was the first person to be officially condemned for witchcraft in Ireland. We don't know if she really was a witch or not, but she most certainly killed enough people that it turned the entire country against her. Alice was born to a wealthy family of aristocratic merchants in 13th century Ireland. She married William Outlaw in 1280, another wealthy merchant and prominent moneylender. He was also the mayor of Kilkenny, a respected position, but then he mysteriously died. Shortly after his death, Alice married another man named Adam in 1302, but he passed away as well. She went on to marry a third man named Richard Duval, an incredibly wealthy landowner. Shortly after they got hitched, he too wound up dead. Her fourth and final husband was Jean Lepeur, who also died after marrying Alice. After her fourth husband passed away under mysterious circumstances, it was fairly obvious that Alice had something to do with their deaths. The children of John Le Peur, as well as relatives of her previous marriages and her own stepchildren, accused Alice of using poison to murder her husbands. They also claimed she practiced sorcery, which gained the attention of the authorities. She was accused of sacrificing animals to summon demons, as well as having an intimate relationship with an incubus. It was also believed that she organized coven meetings with other witches. Just before she was to be executed for her crimes, Alice escaped and was never seen again. Number 1. The mass poisoning of 331 BC. In 331 BC, 200 Roman women were charged with mass poisoning after multiple important people in the Senate died abruptly. Roman historian Titus Livius Patavinus is responsible for describing the sensational trial and the events leading up to it. It all started when important men inside the Senate began to drop dead like flies. An investigation team couldn't figure out what was going on until one of the women squealed on the rest of the guilty party. They soon learned that about 20 women of noble rank were cooking up poisons and then handing them out to other noblewomen to kill their husbands. According to Professor Richard Bowman, an expert in ancient Rome, this was part of a rebellion. Noblewomen wanted to kill their husbands as a way to protest against Roman marriage. At the trial, 30 of the women who had prepared their deadly tonics volunteered to drink them in order to prove they were totally harmless. However, they all dropped dead and avoided whatever horrific punishment the Roman Senate was planning to dish out. The fate of the other 170 women who had been involved in the murders is unknown, although it's believed they were driven into exile. Thanks for watching! What do you think? Killers or just misunderstood? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know if you'd like to see a part 2. There's lots more stories like these. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Bye!